สวัสดีท่านวิทยากรและผู้เข้าร่วมอบรมทุกท่านนะคะขอต้อนรับทุกท่านค่ะเข้าสู่งาน Sustainable Bond Issuance in Practice นะคะและการจัดงานสัมมนาในครั้งนี้ค่ะสมาคมตลาดตราสารหนี้ไทยนะคะ Thai Bond Market Association นะคะได้จัดขึ้นค่ะภายใต้โครงการสนับสนุนและส่งเสริมการออกตราสารหนี้เพื่อความยั่งยืนหรือ ESG Bond นะคะซึ่งแน่นอนค่ะสนับสนุนโดยกองทุนส่งเสริมการพัฒนาตลาดทุนนะคะ Thailand Capital Market Development Fund หรือ CMDF นะคะทุกท่านคะที่ผ่านมาเรามีการจัดสัมมนากันมาแล้ว2ครั้งนะคะในครั้งนี้ค่ะจะเป็นการลงในรายละเอียดนะคะเป็นการจัดทำเวิร์กช็อปนะคะซึ่งทุกท่านจะได้เรียนรู้จากผู้ที่มีประสบการณ์จริงนะคะเพื่อให้ได้เข้าใจถึงกระบวนการในการระดมทุนนะคะผ่านการออกตราสารหนี้ ESG Bond จนสามารถนำไปปฏิบัติจริงได้ค่ะสำหรับผู้เข้าอบรมในวันนี้นะคะทุกท่านนะคะมาจากหลากหลายกลุ่มอุตสาหกรรมด้วยกันนะคะไม่ว่าจะเป็นกลุ่มพลังงานนะคะอสังหาริมทรัพย์นะคะแล้วก็อุตสาหกรรมอาหารรวมกว่า150ท่านตรงนี้นะคะขอต้อนรับทุกท่านด้วยค่ะสำหรับอเจนดาของวันนี้นะคะเราจะเรียนกันช่วงเช้า2เซสชันนะคะแล้วก็จะมีพักเบรกขั้นให้นะคะแล้วก็จะมีรับประทานอาหารกลางวันระหว่างนั้นก็จะมีการบรรยายพิเศษโดย CGIF นะคะแล้วก็มาต่อที่เซสชันช่วงบ่ายอีก2เซสชันรวมถึงเวิร์กช็อปค่ะค่ะและในลำดับแรกนี้นะคะขออนุญาตเรียนเชิญดร.สมจินต์ สอนไพศาลค่ะกรรมการผู้จัดการสมาคมตลาดตราสารหนี้ไทยขึ้นกล่าวต้อนรับทุกท่านค่ะขอเรียนเชิญค่ะ
ครับสวัสดีครับเรียนคุณยูจีน ว่อง CEO Sustainable Finance Institute Asia คุณยงยุทธ เศรษฐวิวัฒน์ Managing Director Group Treasurer บริษัทไทยยูเนียนกรุ๊ปบอร์ดของเรานะครับคุณแจ่มจันทร์ สิริการจนาวงศ์ผู้ช่วยกรรมการผู้จัดการใหญ่ธนาคารกรุงศรีอยุธยาคุณยอดฤดี สันตติกุลกรรมการผู้อำนวยการบริษัทหลักทรัพย์เอเชียพลัสจำกัดคุณบุษราไตรทิพย์เจริญชัยรองผู้จัดการกองทุนส่งเสริมการพัฒนาตลาดทุนหรือที่เรารู้จักกันดีในชื่อ CMDF สปอนเซอร์ของเราครับท่านผู้มีเกียรติท่านผู้บริหารองค์กรต่างๆผมขอบพระคุณมากๆนะครับที่สละเวลามาร่วมสัมมนากับเราในวันนี้พวกเราทุกคนรู้ดีว่าเรื่องของสิ่งแวดล้อมของโลกเนี่ยเป็นเรื่องใหญ่แล้วพวกเราที่อยู่ในตลาดทุนทั้งกลุ่มที่เป็นบริษัทจดทะเบียนเป็น Issuers ใน Bonds Market ทั้ง Underwriters นะครับรวมทั้งรัฐวิสาหกิจของเรารวมทั้งภาครัฐของเราเนี่ยล้วนแต่มีโอกาสที่จะเป็น Influencer ที่จะเปลี่ยนแปลงโลกของเราให้มีโอกาสที่จะดีขึ้นที่จะหยุดหรือชะลอการเข้าไปสู่ภาวะที่แย่ลงไปเรื่อยๆนะครับแล้วก็เราเองต้องขอบคุณ CMDF มากๆที่สปอนเซอร์เรื่องนี้มาตลอดใน2 ปีที่ผ่านมาแล้วก็อย่างที่น้องเบลได้บอกไปเราจัดสัมมนาครั้งนี้เป็นครั้งที่3แล้วแต่ว่า2ครั้งแรกเนี่ยเราจัดประมาณครึ่งวันและครั้งนี้สิ่งที่เราตั้งใจก็คือเราอยากจะจัดให้มันมีความลึกจริงๆแล้วก็ไม่ใช่แค่เป็นลักษณะของ introduction แต่จะเป็นเรื่องของ practical knowledge experience sharing จนกระทั่งถึง workshop ที่พวกเราจะได้หยิบยก issue ของพวกเราขึ้นมา discuss กันนะครับแล้ววันนี้เนี่ยผมดีใจมากนะครับที่พวกเรานะครับน้องๆของเราก็ตั้งใจมากนะครับทีมที่พยายามจะหาคนที่ดีที่สุดที่เราจะหาได้ในโลกในประเทศของเรานะครับซึ่งอย่างคุณยูจีน ว่องซึ่งเป็น CEO ของ Sustainable Finance Institute Asia เนี่ยอันนี้เป็นองค์กรไม่แสวงหากำไรนะครับซึ่งเป็นคนที่เป็นองค์กรที่สปอนเซอร์ ASEAN Taxonomy Board นะครับซึ่งมีองค์ประกอบก็คือแบงก์ชาติของประเทศต่างๆในอาเซียนรวมทั้งกระทรวงการคลังแล้วก็ regulators ในธุรกิจประกันแล้วก็ASEAN Capital Market Regulators ต่างๆรวมทั้งกลต.ก็เป็นอยู่ในบอร์ดนี้นะครับก็เราเชื่อว่าเราหาคนที่มีความรู้เรื่องนี้อย่างลึกๆจริงๆเนี่ยมากกว่านี้ไม่ได้แหละนะครับแล้วก็พี่ยงยุทธนะครับผมได้มีโอกาสฟังท่าน บรรยายผมคิดว่าเราน่าจะหาคนที่รู้จริงและไม่ใช่แค่รู้แต่ว่าได้ทำมาจริงๆแล้วมีใจเป็นครูยินดีที่จะแบ่งปันนะครับมากกว่านี้ไม่ได้แล้วก็เดี๋ยวพวกเราผมเชื่อว่าพวกเราจะ enjoy อย่างมากในการเรียนรู้จากพี่ยงยุทธในช่วงถัดไปนะครับเรื่องของการissue ESG bonds จาก TU นะครับแล้วก็ในช่วงบ่ายนะครับเราได้คุณกอบรัฐนะครับจากDNV นะครับซึ่งเป็นผู้ที่ทำเรื่องของ external revolver มากที่สุดในประเทศไทยแล้วก็เป็นผู้นำในโลกนะครับจะได้มาแชร์ถึงประสบการณ์ต่างๆที่ผ่านมารวมทั้งตัวความท้าทายต่างๆด้วยนะครับแล้วก็ช่วงสุดท้ายนะครับซึ่งก็เป็นช่วงที่สำคัญมากที่สุดอีกช่วงหนึ่งเรามีคุณโกศินทร์พึงโสพลนะครับจาก ADB แล้วก็คุณฝนทิพย์ยุทธเสรีจะมาคุยเรื่องของ sustainable finance และก็ทำเป็นเวิร์กช็อปที่พวกเราจะมีโอกาสนั่งเป็นกลุ่มแล้วก็ได้คุยกันหยิบประเด็นของแต่ละเซกเตอร์ขึ้นมาคุยกันอย่างแท้จริงก็ขอให้ทุกท่านได้ enjoy แล้วก็เรียนรู้แล้วก็นำไปสู่การปฏิบัติจริงในเรื่องของ ESG financing ในตลอดวันนี้นะครับขอบคุณครับ
ขอบคุณดร.สมจินต์ สอนไพศาลนะคะกรรมการผู้จัดการสมาคมตลาดตราสารหนี้ไทยสำหรับคำกล่าวต้อนรับนะคะทุกท่านคะสำหรับหัวข้อแรกนะคะจะเป็นการให้ความรู้เกี่ยวกับหลักการและแนวปฏิบัติของการออก ESG bond นะคะกับหัวข้อ Concept of Sustainable Bond Financing นะคะและแน่นอนว่าวิทยากรในเซสชันนี้นะคะเป็นผู้ที่มีประสบการณ์ยาวนานนะคะในเรื่องของ ESG bond และ Taxonomy ค่ะ Please welcome Mr. Eugene Wong Chief Executive Officer from Sustainable Finance Institute Asia ค่ะสวัสดีค่ะเชิญค่ะYes.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. While I don't understand Thai, I'm sure they're all very nice things. So thank you very much for that. Firstly, thank you very much the Thai Bond Market Association for having me here. It is really my pleasure to speak to all of you about a topic very close to my heart. But first, I want to say I'm actually not the real expert in the room because there are many people here who probably know much more than me, and Kun Jamjan is one of them. So if you have hard questions, don't ask me. Look for her and ask her after this session. Oh, okay, not close enough. Okay, let me first start with a very basic thing, right? So why is it that we are now starting to hear a lot about sustainable bonds? And this has been a real phenomena in the last 3-5 years, because if you look at 10 years ago, what's a sustainable bond? People don't really know about it. And in fact, I remember the ASEAN capital market regulators, including SEC Thailand, talking about this back in 2015. And we said this will probably be the future of financing. And at the end of the session, I'll tell you why. So that is when the ASEAN capital market started working on sustainable finance and trying to build the infrastructure for it. But let me first start with a bit of explanation why it's so important for us to talk about sustainability, because all of you here are actually intermediaries. You are here to connect the money to where the money is needed. So the money actually needs to flow to the real economy. And in order to do that, we have to ensure that we understand what this is meant to do. So firstly, we are all experiencing climate change, right? I know this year in Thailand, in some parts, back in April, I think the temperatures went up to 51 degrees. I was actually in Brunei at that time and sitting together with people from Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and in some parts of it, of Indochina, actually went up to 47 degrees. It's very, very high. So we've never experienced temperatures like this. And also flooding. We see flooding. So what's really happening is climate change is causing a lot of disruption to us. We are experiencing things like rising sea levels. So a lot of coastal areas are being submerged. You may not know this, but in the last 6 years, over 44 million children were displaced because of climate change. And of that 44 million, globally, almost 10 million came from our neighbor, Philippines. So climate change is very, very real in Southeast Asia, right? And not just that, because of climate change, the oceans are starting to change as well. So we see that acidity is rising, sea life is being threatened. We see all those extreme weather events causing economic damage, damage to buildings, damage to houses, and there's a great threat to the loss of biodiversity. So 1 million, and the figure is 1 million species of plants and animals are now being threatened. So it is very important that we address this issue. Now, to address climate change, it's going to take a lot of effort, and many of you may have heard that we are not really doing enough and we can't seem to do enough because we have to reduce our emissions levels relative to 2019 by 43% by 2030. That's a very short time from now. And 60% by 2035 so that temperature rises don't go above 1.5 degrees. And really, you have to do this without threatening food production. And why do I say this? Because we hear a lot of people saying, oh, you know, what we should do is we should grow more forests, we get more trees, and things will be okay. But if you really want to offset all the emissions to get to the 1.5, we will actually have to grow trees on land 5 times the size of India. 5 Indias. This will mean that food production will be threatened and there'll be massive dislocations. And of course, the solution to everything, or almost everything, as you know, is actually money. So money is going to help us change how we're going to address all the problems we are facing. Now, the other thing you may hear of, and I see many of you have got the SDG pin like me, is the SDGs. Now, we all want to achieve certain SDG targets by 2030. And there are 17 of them. So the big question is, how are we doing on the SDG targets? The answer is in ASEAN, it's actually very, very bad. So if you look at this chart, this is the 2022 report. If you look at the chart, I've got the middle line there, and we should have been at the middle line in 2022. But you can see that for none of the targets are we close to the middle line. In fact, for 3, which is responsible consumption and production, climate action, and life below water, we're actually regressing. We're below. We're worse off than where we were before. These are real implications. So what does this mean? It means we need money. I'll come back to this point, right? Because according to the ADB, we need 210 billion per year just in ASEAN for adaptation and mitigation alone. That's almost 6% of our GDP. Can you imagine the amount of investments that we need? And according to the IMF, our emerging markets and developing economies need $1.1 trillion annually for mitigation and adaptation. But we're only getting 333 billion, and the gap then is 800 over billion. Of that 333 billion, where's the money really coming from, right? Look at that. It comes mostly from sustainable debt instruments like green bonds and public sources. Green bonds, that's what we're here to talk about today. And we have many experts who will share with us how they have used green bonds to support this. And if you look at the gap for the SDGs, which I showed you just now, it's bad enough we are behind. We are not really meeting target. But now we need 4 trillion annually in developing countries, which includes much of Southeast Asia, an increase from the 2.5 trillion before COVID-19. So COVID-19 has really set us back. What does this mean for you and your clients? It means a lot. Because firstly, this is a real change in the paradigm. There is no turning back, right? Look at the direct business impact. There are so many parties now that have signed on to a net zero pledge. It means that if they're customers of your clients or businesses you know, those businesses will also be forced to align with a net zero pledge in order to support their customers. The financial losses are actually increasing, and this is actually starting to worry a lot of regulators. Everything from banks to asset managers, to insurance companies, face the risk of asset stranding. It means the asset really becomes useless and you have to write it off because of climate change. And they become useless either because governments say, oh, you cannot run this coal plant anymore. Or if you have a highly polluting industry, there's a legislation or customers just boycott it and you can't sell anymore. So it becomes useless, completely useless. And also, you may know, for those who have children, society has become more knowledgeable and enlightened. Our children actually, apart from playing video games like PUBG, also come and talk about what is happening to the world. Now, I have two children, one 20 years old and one 14 years old, and they are actually very concerned about what is happening. They feel it because we won't be around, or many of us won't be around. I see many young faces here. You'll be around to suffer, but the young people are worried that they will suffer. The other thing is that technology has improved a lot. So, I mean, in the old days, solar, wind, they were not efficient. They were expensive, but now they become so much cheaper. If you look at the price drop for solar, if you look at the price drop for wind, it's become so much more feasible. So, one of the ideas that people have is we can ride through this, but it's not true, because in the worst case scenario, and I know we have ADB to give a talk at lunch, but ADB will tell you that there is a possibility that we could lose up to 24% of our GDP because of climate change. Don't forget the suits. Everywhere now, people are starting to sue governments and companies to adopt climate change. You, your clients, may end up being sued. How bad are the suits? Actually, there's one suit in Thailand at the moment, but the real action is happening in the US. I think they have 1,600 cases going on. Australia has 130 cases going on. And in a landmark case in Korea, an unborn child has actually joined a suit. If you look it up, it's called the woodpecker case. So many people are starting to take action. Right? What are we doing in ASEAN? So in ASEAN, from a financial perspective, the central banks and the capital market regulators have come up with 3 plans. The first is the ASEAN Capital Market Forum's roadmap for ASEAN sustainable capital markets. Now, Thai SEC is part of this effort. The other one is the Working Committee on Capital Market Development's report on promoting sustainable finance in ASEAN. Again, Bank of Thailand and the Ministry of Finance of Thailand are part of this effort. And the third is one by the central banks with BOT there on their role in managing climate and environment-related risks. Now, if I summarize for you these 3 reports and what they actually try to achieve, it's 4 things. The first is, we're all not talking the same language for sustainable finance. So we need to have a common taxonomy. And of course, that's what I'm here to talk about. The second is that we need to transition, so we need to have transition standards. The third is we have to have disclosures in order to help people make informed decisions and for them to be able, for those reporting to be accountable to their stakeholders. If we can get these 3 things called the pillars correct, then we get the first thing, which is what we really want, which is to strengthen the demand and supply for sustainable finance. Very important for ASEAN is that we all realize we cannot flick a switch and turn green overnight. That's impossible. If we do that, there will be massive social and economic dislocations. Many of you may have even read that, for instance, in the US, there are also problems because as you try and install big solar plants in farms, it affects something else. It affects the biodiversity of the farms. And grasslands are replaced with sand. Also, you've heard about the problems in Europe, for instance, when a couple of years back, when the sun didn't shine and the wind didn't blow and solar power and wind power weren't effective. Don't get me wrong, wind and solar are very important, but we need to ensure that we have the right infrastructure to support it. In China, there are problems with the hydro dams. Again, we want to move these efforts, but as we move towards renewables, we have to make sure two things happen. The first is our infrastructure can support it and the people don't suffer as a result of the infrastructure not being able to support it. The second is the cost. It is expensive. It is expensive for us to decarbonize. So we need to do this in an orderly manner, in an effective manner. And all the regulators have recognized this in their reports. So this is a horrible thing, right? Because I'm sure all of you hear and read different sources and you've got all sorts of different types of sustainability bonds coming up. That's me in the middle, by the way. So you have transition bonds, you have sustainability-linked bonds, green bonds, social bonds, SDG bonds, climate bonds. What are all these things? Now, interestingly, I think you've heard of blue bonds. Blue bonds are fairly intuitive because you think blue, ocean, water. How about yellow? Does anyone know what a yellow bond is? Any idea? Nothing to do with mango. Nothing to do with pineapples. Anybody has any idea? But yellow bonds are something in India that support solar power because the sun is yellow. So if you look at the range of bonds that are coming out, wow, big names, very difficult. What is what? So how do you classify? I go back to this very simple representation from the International Capital Market Association. And if you want a clear definition, if you want to start forgetting what names are, but looking at where they fit in, this is a very good illustration that I recommend you look at, right? So it starts with the large definition of sustainable finance, which is anything that supports economic and financial stability. Then you narrow it down a bit. You have ESG, so everyone's heard of ESG. Now BlackRock doesn't want to call it ESG anymore, but it is still everything to do with the environment, social issues, and governance. And within that, you can have green finance, which talks about both environment, as well as climate finance, which talks about action to support the climate, as well as social finance. And then you have governance as well, which is important. Now, you may have also heard of this other thing called impact finance. So impact finance looks at how investments can have a clear, discernible impact on the environment, climate, and social aspects, right? So if you're ever confused, don't be. Just look at this IGMA diagram, and you will be able to fit things where they should be. How have the issuances done? Well, actually, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I gave it to you for illustrative purposes. So you can see in terms of global GSS plus, so for GSS, it's green, social, and sustainable. That's why it stands. And plus is actually to denote other variations of it, like sustainability-linked bonds, transition bonds. If you look at it, we had a peak in 2021, but then it started to decline in 2022. And that decline was caused by a general situation globally. That was increasing interest rates, because low interest rates were really helpful in pushing bond issuances, as you all know, and also declining economic performance. But we've bounced back in 2023, despite the same situation plus extra geopolitics happening. So it just goes to show this agenda is something that we need to address, and it's an imperative. So no matter what happens, we still have to address the sustainability agenda, right? But if you look at the total bond issuances and what the GSS bonds constitute as a percentage of that, it's quite low. It's still 12.8%. So there's a lot of room to grow. And what's the situation in ASEAN like? Different. Because if you look at it, while there's a dip in 2022, globally, it has continued to rise in ASEAN. It's grown more than 5-fold in the last 5 years. It's very big. Right? And if you look at the outstanding bonds that are GSS bonds versus all bonds issued in ASEAN, it's still small. It's only 2.8. Of course, outstanding bonds comprise bonds that were issued earlier on. So again, indicating room for growth. And if you look at the type of issuances, now this is really, really interesting, because if you look at the issuances that we're having, what you can see is the sustainability issuances are really catching up with the green. Right? What about in terms of currency? If you look at it, it's a lot of local currency interests. It's not just about foreign currency. Right? And if you look at the total ASEAN GSS plus bond issuances versus our total bond issuances, very, very small still, 0.86, lots of room to grow. Now, there are some problems that have caused that because, and I'll explain to you later, we need to address two things. The first is that our own our own environment for the sustainable finance ecosystem needs to be addressed so that it becomes clearer what these bonds are, and it makes it easier for them to be issued. So if we look by country, this is really, really interesting, because by country, you can see that one country has done really, really well. That's you guys, Thailand. Right? And I must say, later on as I'll show you, the Thai issuances have been very innovative and also very effective. Right, so as we talk about sustainable bonds, I must think there must be somebody who's giving some guidance, there must be some sort of industry agreement. Well, there is actually. It is not as prescriptive or not as defining as some people may want it to be, but we do have consensus on sustainable bonds globally. So I'm sure all of you had heard of ICMA. So the ICMA has put out some guidances which have been used by almost everyone. The first is the Green Bond Principles, which really talks about green bonds. The second, Social Bond Principles, which talks about social bonds. And so interestingly, you'll find that social bonds aren't that widely used in Southeast Asia. They are used in places like Japan, but they're not that widely used. The third is actually sustainability bonds, and that is actually a growing area. So these three principles actually represent a process to provide market integrity. So what is this process? The process prescribes that you actually should have the right types of disclosures about your use of proceeds, the process for project evaluation and selection, management of proceeds, and reporting. What does this mean? It means that when you issue any of these bonds, wherever you are, whether it be in Thailand, whether it be in the US, whether it be in Lithuania, you would actually want to ensure that these are the things that are discussed. Now, the other thing is that these principles also recommend that all issuers come up with bond frameworks or legal documents to show how their issuances will align with the principles. Now, one of the things about the principles is that they are broad. So, in many situations, we will still need some form of assurance that it is consistent, that all the issuances are consistent, they meet a particular requirement. And this is where external assessors come in. So my friend Thomas is here. He's an assessor. He'll tell you all about it later on, and Kobrat as well. I think Kobrat's here too. So this is where the external reviews are actually quite important. But the Green Bond Principles, Social Bond Principles, and Sustainability Bond Guidelines, you notice, have one thing in common. They all talk about use of proceeds, use of proceeds. So these are called use of proceeds bonds, which means that the bonds you issue under these particular principles are used for a particular purpose. But what if you, as a company, what if a company wants to transform itself? It's not sure, the proceeds are not for one particular thing, but for general operations. There was always a gap. And of course, with the advent of what you hear now as sustainability-linked bonds, that area has been addressed to some extent. So sustainability-linked bonds actually allow you to link the bonds to the performance of the company in certain things which you select, right? So there are key performance indicators which match with the goals of the company for sustainability. Right? And we have Thai Union here, excellent issuance done by Krung Sri. And you have the ability to actually be able to calibrate against specific targets. So I think sustainability-linked bonds have actually changed the complexion quite a bit, but it has also caused a problem because there are many issuances that have attracted criticism. Criticism because the targets were either too easy to achieve, the penalty for not achieving those targets were too small. But of course, like everything else, it is a growing area. So we need to see how it grows and we'll need to give it some time to grow. Along the way, the ICMA has also issued a climate transition finance handbook because transition finance is very important. I talked about transition just now. So ICMA has also issued a climate transition finance handbook, which essentially will guide the use of these principles in a situation where the proceeds are used for transition finance. So what is the ICMA approach like? Well, if you look at the ICMA approach, which I won't go too much into because you can look at it yourself, basically the ICMA approach looks at how you can move from the elements of the transition finance handbook, which are really about the strategy and governance, the business model and environment materiality, the climate transition strategy that is science-based, and it's very important that I say science-based because we've been working with a lot of companies and actually they have not been really science-based in the way they want to approach transition. So science-based transition approaches become very important, right? And also in terms of transparency, it looks at those elements and it tries to see how those elements apply to use of proceeds which are focused on projects, as well as where the proceeds are focused on what the issuer wants to do. So I'll leave you to have a look at this because I think it is a very important aspect of how the existing principles are used for transition finance, which I believe will be a very big area moving forward. So what have we done in ASEAN? Well, in 2017, the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum released the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. This is in October 2017, and in November 2018 they released the Social Bond Standards and the Sustainability Bond Standards. And those standards really were actually meant to help refine the ICMA standards I spoke about just now for use in ASEAN. So they're actually based on the ICMA standards, but they are specifically designed to address ASEAN issues. And in 2023, the ASEAN released the ASEAN Sustainability Linked Bond Standards, which actually, 2023, they released the ASEAN Sustainability Linked Bond Standards, which actually again reflects the ICMA standards. So how have these standards done? Well, before I go into how these standards have done, I want to draw to your attention the difference between the ASEAN standards and also the ICMA standards, because I did say the ASEAN standards are based off the ICMA standards. So why are they different? The reason why the capital market regulators had come up with the ASEAN standards was to help create an asset class that would address the needs of ASEAN specifically. So firstly, to use this standard and be labeled under this standard, you must have a connection to ASEAN. That's different from the ICMA principles, because in the ICMA principles, anybody can issue standards, can use the standards. The second is that ASEAN took a very, very big step at that time, which was which had different levels of support, because ASEAN said, for our green standards, let us not include fossil fuels. Why was that the case? Because the ASEAN regulators foresaw that in the future, we would have a class of instruments or class of labeling called transition. So they said, if we're going to use fossil fuels, let's wait for transition. And it was actually a very, very advanced form of thinking. Because at that time, everybody said transition is greenwashing. There's no way you can do transition. It's greenwashing. But the ASEAN regulators said, no, we will keep green bonds to green, and we will wait for transition, and we will push a transition standard. And I can tell you, because I was involved in that process, there was a lot of discussion about it. But ASEAN said, we will do this. Why was there discussion? Well, two things. The first is, there was a group of people who said that if you exclude fossil fuels, no one will issue bonds under these standards. There was the other group who said that if you can't exclude fossil fuels because there's no other classification that can include the use of fossil fuels that are aligned to climate action. So both groups were wrong. And the ASEAN regulators believed that both groups would be wrong because they believed that there would be a class of labeling or a class of instruments called transition later on. So they went ahead anyway and they said, no fossil fuels. For social bonds, they included things that were culturally important to ASEAN. And they said, we cannot have things related to alcohol, gambling, tobacco, or weaponry. So this was not specifically specified in the ICMA standards. And in terms of continuous information, the ASEAN regulators actually said you have to give more information. So you need to have a website where all the information is there, and we encourage you to report more frequently than the ICMA requirements. Also, the last one is on external review. So external review remains voluntary for the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, Social Bond Standards, and Sustainability Bond Standards, very much like in the ICMA standards. But there is a difference. So in ASEAN, the ASEAN regulators wanted the specific expertise of the assessor or the reviewer in that particular area that they were reviewing disclosed. This was not required under the ICMA standards because this was very nascent in ASEAN. We didn't know what qualifications, what capabilities the assessors had. We were worried that the external reviewers would come up and actually not really have the expertise but give an opinion. So that is why the additional condition was put in. But for the ASEAN Sustainability Linked Bond Standards, there's an extra condition. In the ICMA equivalent, external review is not required before issuance, it's required post-issuance. But in the ASEAN version, external review is required both pre and post-issuance. And again, it is due to the nascent nature of sustainable finance in ASEAN and the need to ensure the credibility and integrity of the market. So you heard just now, right? I was saying that a lot of people said the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, Social Bond Standards, and Sustainability Bond Standards won't take off because there are simply too many people who want to issue on the basis of the use of fossil fuels, and no one's going to issue without fossil fuels being allowed. Well, the answer after all this time is those people were wrong, because the ASEAN Green Bond Standards now have reached 49 billion in label issuances. Okay? When I say label issuances, it means it excludes those other issuances who reference and align to these standards but don't label according to them. They may be labeled as other things. So the minimum we have labeled under these standards is actually 49 billion. Which means that an ASEAN asset class has been created. No surprise, where is the largest area? Sustainability is the biggest area. It's not green. Everyone thinks it would have been green, but no. Because in ASEAN, it is important to look at the green aspects and the social aspects together. So that is why sustainability is the biggest. And consistent with the wider GSS issuances, which are, I showed you just now, which are issuances labeled using any standard. Thailand is the largest issuer. So again, there are a lot of prospects for Thailand moving forward, right? And if you look at it from a success perspective, we actually have 6 out of the 10 ASEAN countries having issuances from the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, Sustainability Bond Standards, and Social Bond Standards, including Cambodia. Okay, so the first issuance of the Sustainability Linked Bond Standards actually happened in October last year, showing that we can start to have a direction moving forward. Okay, now I talked about SDG bonds just now, so many of you may have heard about SDG bonds. It's not a new class of bonds, so to speak. They are still GSS bonds, but they are bonds that are specifically linked to the SDGs. Why is this important? Actually, if you look at it, a lot of companies have started issuing SDG bonds. For instance, even in the US, you see people like Amazon, Microsoft, they're issuing SDG bonds because some investors are interested in sustainability, but they are interested in specific SDGs. It could be everything from eradication of poverty to life below water to climate action. So some issuers find it easier to reach out to investors if they actually can target specific SDGs. As a result, the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, together with the Asian Development Bank, had issued an SDG bond toolkit to guide ASEAN issuers to be able to issue SDG bonds. And this was not meant to create a standard, but was meant to help provide a consistent process in ASEAN for SDG bonds to be issued. If you look at the issuances of SDG bonds in APEC alone, where are the key areas and key potential? The key SDG goals are actually climate action, sustainable cities and communities, industry innovation and infrastructure, affordable and clean energy, clean water and sanitation. Now, you might have noticed earlier on just now when I talked about SDGs, some of these areas which are the ones which we have regressed. But really, it is in these areas that we have to start looking at how we push more capital. What are the proceeds really used for? Renewable energy continues to be number one. Energy efficiency, which is important. Clean transportation. So we can see the trends for the use of SDG bond proceeds. Okay, well, I've said a lot in a very short time. So what I wanted to do was take a very short break because I think all of you must be very bored of my voice, to see if you have any questions that you'd like to ask before I go on. No? Anybody? Okay. I'll just give you 30 seconds to reset your minds before we move on to the next thing. Can I just ask how many of you here actually would rate your... Okay, let's do this, right? I just wanted to ask about familiarity with taxonomies. So how many of you actually know what a taxonomy is? Okay, how many don't know what a taxonomy is? Okay, great, thank you. Because there's someone there who's pretending, that's Kun Jamjan, so let's ignore her. It's very important for me to know this because I need to know how to introduce it to you. Okay, 30 seconds are up. So, okay, how many of you know about coffee? Okay, I'm getting worried because people don't know about coffee. How many people know about coffee? How many people buy coffee at least once a week? No? Nobody drinks coffee here? Okay. Okay, at least once a week, who buys coffee? Anywhere? Starbucks, Amazon? No? 1, 2... 5 a day, okay. That is probably the correct answer. Okay, so if you go and buy coffee, and you go and order a latte, an Americano, a macchiato, do you notice that everyone may serve it in a slightly different way, but the components are all the same? Whether you go to a Starbucks, whether you go to an Amazon. So Starbucks is global, right? And Amazon is actually Thai, but it is also moving around the world. And did you know that Amazon is actually the 6th largest coffee chain at the moment? Yeah, I didn't know that too until my Thai friend told me. And of course, you can go to your local cafe, your local barista will make a coffee for you. But if you go to any of these places, it's the same. If you order an Americano, it's just an espresso with hot water. If you order a cappuccino, it has steam milk and a heavy layer of milk foam. When I was growing up in Malaysia, when maybe I'm only 26 years old, so when I was 13 years old, there were I used to go to some of these restaurants and they serve different things, right? So if you order a cappuccino, some people actually give you coffee with milk, which they try and foam, they beat by hand. Some people actually give you coffee with, believe it or not, whipped cream. So this was a big problem for a lot of the Malaysians and tourists who came because you never knew what sort of coffee you're going to get in some of the shops. You're hoping for something just with milk, but you end up getting something with whipped cream. So one thing that's really helped the coffee industry and made things very convenient for us is that whether we go to a Starbucks here or whether you go to a Starbucks in Bulgaria or Turkey, you will get the same thing. And this is about standardization. Standardization not of the way you make it, but what it is. And it makes it a lot easier because it makes it easier for people to understand what they're getting. What do investors like? What do financiers like? They like standardization, right? It's the same as you. You open an account in a bank, and then you like to know that a current account or checking account, which is quite obsolete these days, but has the same features. You get a checkbook, you get certain opportunities to do certain things. It pays a certain rate or may not pay a certain rate, but it has certain charges. You understand all those things. So investors want consistency. It is very difficult for them if there's no consistency because it means that if nothing is what they think it means or people have different ideas about what they say, for instance, a cappuccino has whipped cream instead of froth milk, then investors actually have to continue to keep on doing more due diligence on every investment that they make. So one of the things that I mentioned just now, the 4 areas that the ASEAN capital market regulators and central banks looked at is actually how can we all speak a common language? And the result would be a common taxonomy because this would make life so easy for everybody. But of course, it is not easy getting 10 countries together in ASEAN. Right. So then you may ask, why do we need 10 countries to get together? We already have national taxonomies, for example. Thailand has the Thai taxonomy, Thailand taxonomy phase 1. Singapore has the Singapore Asia taxonomy. Philippines has a taxonomy. Indonesia has the Indonesian taxonomy for sustainable finance. Malaysia has 2 taxonomies actually, one sustainable and responsible investment taxonomy and the other the climate change principle-based taxonomy. So why do we really need all this? We need a common language, just like the coffee I spoke about just now, to drive sustainable finance. National taxonomies are needed, but what they do is they address national interests and national agenda. They will not address a regional agenda. Why is it important to address a regional agenda? Well, firstly, we have to remember ASEAN is going to be the 4th largest economic bloc in 2030. Investors are going to think of us as one single asset class. Secondly, we also want to have a voice because sometimes if we look at the things that are being imposed, they don't work for ASEAN. ASEAN is a very diverse region. Our largest GDP per capita per annum is 82,000 and our lowest is 1,100. The average is 5,400. So I had a conversation with some Europeans the other day. Well, actually, it's not the other day. It's a couple of years back when they were still saying that it's best to use one single taxonomy for everybody, right? That's the EU taxonomy. So I had a conversation with them and they said, look, your situation, your diverse economic situation, social situation, same in Europe. We have Luxembourg and we have Bulgaria. But I said the difference is your GDP per capita per annum, on average across Europe, is 37,500 US dollars. We're at 5,400. Do you think we can do the same things as you? Because our resources are very, very different. So it is important that ASEAN also comes up with something to show the world that there is an alternative that suits ASEAN and that can actually drive the sort of behavior we want. We cannot give people targets that they cannot meet. So in ASEAN, we actually need to contextualize against our own economies, social situations, and also the resources that we have. So we need an ASEAN taxonomy firstly, because as you know, and I mentioned just now, many of our countries are coming out of taxonomies on their own. So we will have fragmentation across ASEAN as an economic bloc if we have different taxonomies. We also have a lot of different efforts going on within countries. So we have different government bodies doing slightly different things, and we need to consolidate that into one language, right? We need to secure that sort of global acceptance. And we can only secure the global acceptance if we come together to provide consistency, and consistency is very important, credibility, and transparency. Right? If we can do this, we will facilitate better allocation of capital. Because everybody, again, like the coffee, right? We all know what we're buying, we all know what we're ordering, we all know what we're serving. And that's also important. It is important that the people who use the capital also know what they're expected to do to be called a certain thing. So imagine this, back to the coffee example, if you are a shop and no one told you how everyone sees a cappuccino to be, your ratio of coffee to milk could be wrong, and you have an angry customer. It's the same. Many businesses have said, we don't know what sustainability is, so we can't be sustainable. And that is one of the aspects that we need the taxonomy for. It's not just about those who are providing capital, it's also about those using capital. With all this, as the fourth largest economic bloc, we can develop a sustainable asset class. Can this really be done? Well, I think the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, Social Bond Standards, and Sustainability Bond Standards have shown that. Because when we first started, they said, no, it cannot be done. Well, it's a $50 billion asset class now. And that is on simple standards. What if we had something much bigger? So what do we need? We need a taxonomy, which is now called the ASEAN taxonomy, to facilitate equivalence between national taxonomies and to be the overarching guide and language for our member states. And this happened because at the 7th ASEAN Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting in 2021, they approved the creation of an ASEAN Taxonomy Board to develop, maintain, and promote an ASEAN Taxonomy that, if you read the language, will be the overarching guide for all our member states, complementing their respective national sustainability initiatives. And what does that mean? It means that national sustainability initiatives means go ahead, have your own taxonomy. It's fine, it's for your national agenda. But we want one to serve as the common language for sustainable finance for us. Importantly, because of what I said just now, we need to be inclusive. And this is the big challenge, right? How do you have a taxonomy that is inclusive for our member states with 1,100 US dollars of GDP per capita per annum and 82,000 and all those in between? You have to have this as a multi-tiered taxonomy. Cannot have one single threshold. And you must also have this taxonomy as instructed to facilitate an orderly and effective transition. So this was the problem with using a taxonomy with a single threshold like the EU taxonomy. So if you look at the EU taxonomy, let's take, so I'll come back to what taxonomy is again, but if you look at the EU taxonomy, to qualify as taxonomy aligned for, say, producing energy, your project or activity cannot emit more than 100 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. That's it, 100. If you hit that threshold, you're in. If you perform much worse, 200, 300, 400, you're not taxonomy aligned anymore. This obviously is not going to work for a region like ours where people are very diverse, where the countries are very diverse. And as a result, the solution for us was to create a multi-tiered taxonomy. Multi-tiered has a couple of meanings, and I'll share that with you later on. Right? Well, as the ASEAN taxonomy was being developed, there were a few key principles that were introduced. The first is that the ASEAN taxonomy actually would be the overarching guide and would be the common language. So everyone's agreed on that, right? You can have your national thresholds, and but the ASEAN taxonomy is the overarching guide. Everyone should reference back to it. And we don't want to be a standalone. We don't want to create a taxonomy for the fun of creating a taxonomy, because it's a lot of work, and it's pointless if you create a taxonomy that cannot connect with the global taxonomies being used. So the ASEAN taxonomy actually is to take into consideration other widely used taxonomies and relevant taxonomies, but we must facilitate a contextualization for ASEAN. So it must be used for ASEAN purposes. This principle actually talks about a principle called interoperability. It means that whatever we do here should have the ability to connect to other things that are being applied globally. Importantly, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board was told that it must ensure that the taxonomy is inclusive and beneficial to all our member states. It can only be good for either the advanced states or good for those emerging states. It must work for everyone. And that is the challenge the board faced. Also, the ASEAN taxonomy is to provide a credible framework, including definitions, and where appropriate, be science-based. Now, why can't everything be science-based? So firstly, we have to remember the ASEAN taxonomy is the ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance, which means that it will cover more than the environment. It will cover more than climate in the future. It's just that right now there's a lot to do. And just even dealing with climate, dealing with the environment, it's a lot of effort. So the ASEAN Taxonomy Board has decided that it will focus on the environment first, and in particular decarbonization, and in the future move on to other SDG aspects. Some of those SDG aspects, as you know, cannot be measured using science-based approaches. And in fact, some of the elements of the taxonomy currently for the environment also may not be quantitative. They may be qualitative, like following a process, for example, or meeting a particular standard. The fourth principle is actually that, the fifth principle is that whatever the taxonomy does, it should be aligned with what the central banks are looking at, the capital market regulators are looking at, and the insurance regulators are looking at. What does this mean? It means that the ASEAN taxonomy will be also consolidating all the approaches of the different sub-segments of the financial markets. Because one of the problems always is that sometimes insurance regulators move a certain way, sometimes capital market regulators move a certain way, and central banks move a certain way, because their mandates are different and they're addressing different constituents. So the ASEAN taxonomy has to ensure that it aligns to all these different initiatives, therefore ensuring a common approach, again, that covers all the different financial sectors. What is the board like? Well, so you must think, given that this instruction came from the finance ministers and central bank governors, how is the board going to be constituted? So obviously, it has to come and be supported by all the central banks, capital market regulators, insurance regulators, and ministries of finance of ASEAN. There are 4 bodies in ASEAN that actually determine the direction of our financial markets. The first is the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, which is just the capital market regulators themselves. And in Thailand, SCC Thailand is a member of this body. There's the Insurance Regulators Meeting, which is obvious, is for insurance regulators. The Office of the Insurance Commission of Thailand is a member. And the senior level Committee on Financial Integration is all the central banks. Bank of Thailand is there. And the ASEAN Working Committee on Capital Market Development is interesting. It looks at capital markets, but it has central banks, ministries of finance, and also capital market regulators in that group. So these are the four groups that actually drive the finance agenda for ASEAN. Each of these groups actually nominates 2 members representing them onto the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. And of course, we have to be inclusive, so we have 10 countries. If each of these groups nominates 2 people, you can only have 8 members. That means that there'll be 2 members of ASEAN who don't have a seat. Additionally, as you can see, in some situations, through the nomination process, some countries are represented twice. In the current board, Malaysia has 2 seats and Vietnam has 2 seats. So because of that, to ensure the inclusivity, any country who's not represented on the board through this nomination process is given the opportunity to collectively nominate someone to be co-opted onto the board. So right now, you can see the composition is actually very well spread out, with only 2 countries having more than 1 seat. The chair of the board is actually Brunei. Let me talk a bit about the ASEAN taxonomy. So before I go into this, let me redefine the taxonomy for you. You remember when you were in school and you did biology? I assume that most people did biology. Okay, who didn't do biology? No? Everybody did biology? Right. Remember, you had this taxonomy of plants and animals, where you had this tree and then they had all the different animals, mammals, fish, insects, and then you had the plants, flowering, non-flowering. So what is a taxonomy? A taxonomy is actually a comprehensive classification system. It's no different from the coffee classification system I talked about just now. It really classifies things into particular groups and gives them particular names. So the ASEAN taxonomy is a classification system for which economic activities are sustainable. That's all it is. It's actually a very simple thing, right? In theory. So I talked about how the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors meeting had actually endorsed the creation of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board back in March. So it was actually endorsed on March the 30th, and many of you won't believe this, but the board was formed on the 31st of March, the very next day, and held its first board meeting. That shows the urgency of this particular initiative. And then the board started working on a conceptual document because it was agreed that the ASEAN taxonomy would be developed in developmental stages. It means that as you develop one version, you will consult on it, and then you will improve that version by adding things onto it. So it's like a building block thing, you keep on adding things to it. The first version, which had the conceptual elements of the taxonomy, was actually released during COP in November 2021. And then it went through a consultation process to see if stakeholders were happy with the conceptual approaches. And this was really a tough process because stakeholders comprises industry participants, it comprises other arms of governments apart from the ministries who are involved in the finance sector. And through that, once the concepts were agreed, the second version of the ASEAN taxonomy was developed. Now this is different, as I'll share with you, because it actually had criteria, not just concepts, but criteria for the energy sector. And then again, this went through a consultation, and version 3, which had more criteria, was then presented. Interestingly, you'll find that the publication of version 2 and version 3 were exactly 1 year apart. So, what is the ASEAN taxonomy's design like? Firstly, as instructed by the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors, it is multi-tiered, and I'll explain to you later on why it's multi-tiered. It's multi-tiered in two ways. It builds on common principles as a foundation. That's the 5 principles I spoke of just now. It's underpinned by environmental objectives and essential criteria. It uses a traffic light system, and it has tiers. So all very foreign language to you now. You're thinking, what is this guy talking about? I have no clue. If you have no clue, it's perfectly fine, because you're not meant to have a clue at this stage unless you are like Kun Jamjan, who has been through the taxonomy a lot. Sorry. Can someone? And, coming down keeps me awake, so I'm so boring I fall asleep talking.
Yeah, I think this one is worth mentioning because ASEAN taxonomy and Thailand taxonomy, we are different. And for Thai taxonomy, we did not have plus standard.
Yep.
So I think the flexibility that ASEAN taxonomy have, I think I would like to have the expert highlight on this. Yeah, because sometimes when we are discussing with client, we also would like to explore some sort of flexibility. That's why some company refer to the ASEAN taxonomy instead of referring to our current, yeah, and also the clarity. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Actually, that's an excellent point, because the Indonesians just released their new taxonomy, and it has it uses 2 frames actually, one principles based and one screening criteria base. I'll explain that to you in a short while, right? So the ASEAN taxonomy actually has 2 elements. The first is a foundation framework. A foundation framework is a principles-based framework. So it doesn't have any criteria. It has a decision tree, and I shall take you through that. It's qualitative based. The second is actually a frame that has technical screening criteria, and that technical screening criteria can come in the form of quantitative thresholds, or it can come in the form of compliance with certain things, like, for example, processes and standards. The ASEAN taxonomy actually focuses on 6 key economic sectors and 3 enabling sectors. So now, with that in mind, let me share with you how the ASEAN taxonomy was constructed. So first, when we start with a taxonomy, we must understand what we want the taxonomy to do. And in the case of the ASEAN taxonomy, as I mentioned to you just now, what we first wanted to do was to help orient capital towards the environment. And of course, in the end, it will cover all the SDGs, but initially it's really to orient capital for the environment. So the ASEAN taxonomy's objectives then are refined and demonstrated through 4 things. The first objective is we want to have money go to climate change mitigation. What's mitigation? So you all know, mitigation is how we reduce the emission of GHG gases, and that means get rid of the coal plants, hopefully, and have renewables. So if money went to renewables, that would be climate change mitigation. The second is adaptation. And adaptation means how do you respond to the changing environment, the floods, the weather pattern changes. If I had to compare adaptation and mitigation together, I'll put in a very simple way for you. Imagine you are in a boat, and you are in the middle of the sea, and this boat has a hole. So the hole is causing water to come in, and your boat is sinking. Actually, that's what's happening to the world today. So we are in a bit of trouble. If you want to fix the hole, that's mitigation, because you're stopping more water from coming in. If you want to empty water, because the water is filling up and your boat is sinking, that is adaptation. So adaptation and mitigation are two things we need, because you need to empty the water and you need to fix the hole. The problem has been for us that a lot of efforts have gone to mitigation, because mitigation is easier to deal with. Adaptation, in many cases, the repayment is a bit harder. So as for those who are actually involved in the commercial aspect of this, you will know that. The third element we look at is the protection of our of healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is a very big thing. In fact, actually, Thailand is one of the few countries where nature is actually enshrined in your constitution. Something very good, I think, which other countries should look towards. The fourth objective we wanted was to put money to promote resource resilience and transition to a circular economy. So these are the four things that the taxonomy currently wants to do. It wants to align, it wants to allocate money towards these four things. Now, in achieving these objectives, what are the things that we should consider? The first is that if we try and achieve one environmental objective, we should not harm another. There's always a possibility of that. Like, for instance, I talked about the US just now, and I'm quite fascinated about this US thing because let's say you build a solar facility, which is great because it's climate change mitigation, right? It generates power without emissions. But unfortunately, in building that, you're actually going to damage the environment around you. That shouldn't be the case, because if you actually contribute to one objective, you should actually not harm another objective. So the first essential criteria that you have to consider in addressing the objectives is, let's not do no significant harm to another one. If you contribute to one environmental objective, don't do significant harm to another one. The second is actually a very unique feature in ASEAN, but the Thailand taxonomy has it. It's called remedial measures to transition. It means what happens if I end up doing some significant harm, which that means I don't meet the first one, but I can fix it. Now, in a traditional approach, and in the approach of developed countries, the answer is once you cause damage, I don't care if you can fix it, your project cannot go ahead. But this is ASEAN. We need every little bit of support we can get to move the needle. So if you can fix that problem that you have caused within a reasonable time with assurance, and for us the reasonable time is 5 years, in Thailand it's 3, then it's fine. You can go ahead, but you have to prove that you can fix it. You have to prove that you can fix it within 5 years. The third aspect is social aspects. It's about the people. So if you are going to close power plants down, if you are going to change the way business is done, you need to ensure that they're not displaced. If you are going to build something, you need to make sure that it doesn't affect adversely the communities around that investment. So the first test of the taxonomy is, do you contribute to any of the environmental objectives? The second is that, do you meet the criteria after you contribute? The ASEAN taxonomy, again, is interesting because there's two frames, as I mentioned just now. The first frame is the qualitative-based sector-agnostic screening criteria. It's qualitative-based, again, I emphasize, called the Foundation Framework. And really what it does is it goes through a series of questions to help you classify your activities or your projects into green, amber, or red. And of course, as you all know, amber means you're transitioning, you're not fully green, but you're trying to get there. This is extremely useful for countries and companies who don't have data. Because if you don't have data, you cannot determine whether you've met a technical screening criteria. And in many countries, people just simply don't have the data. What are you going to do then if people don't have data? The options are simple. Either you sit around doing nothing until you have the data, by which time 2030 and 2050 would have passed, and we're all in great trouble anyway, so it doesn't matter. Or you can start classifying your assets to start realizing where you are, or at least have an idea where you are. So it's very interesting because I spoke to a Malaysian bank who actually, Malaysia actually uses a foundation, principles-based framework, and I spoke to a Malaysian bank and I said, So what do you think of the principles-based framework? And the initial reaction when it first started was, we're not sure how useful this is going to be. I mean, green, yellow, red, so what? Halfway through the process, this banker came and said to me, wow, we found it really useful because although we didn't have the data, when we started classifying our assets and our portfolio, we started to realize how much was in the amber and red and how little we had in the green. The second thing we realized is that from a business perspective, we really want to know how amber and how red this is, so we need to have data. So I think the good thing about having a principles-based approach for many countries is that where there are companies or sectors where you don't have the data, you at least do something, you at least have an idea where you're at, although it may not be the sort of accuracy that you want. So I think Kun Jamjan's point is very important. The Plus standard is actually a frame with technical screening criteria. I'll show what that really means. It focuses on 6 key areas and 3 enabling sectors. The 3 enabling sectors actually are not economic sectors that need to be addressed for GHG emissions, but really support those economic sectors in how we address their emissions problem. So the Plus standard also has 3 tiers, green and 2 amber tiers. I'll explain to you how that works, right? So right now we've issued through versions 2 and 3 the technical screening criteria for electricity, gas, steam, air conditioning, supply, transportation and storage, and construction and real estate. And on the enabling sectors, we have done it for CCUS. And my friends from DNV actually helped us do a lot of work on this to look at what thresholds would be appropriate. Because in setting thresholds, it is a very, very tricky situation, right? You have to set thresholds that are ambitious enough, but also thresholds that work. Because if you set thresholds that are too strict, you will have a major problem in being able to implement them. So this was a real challenge for us because in ASEAN, we have 10 countries with very, very different positioning for every activity, not just sector, but every activity per se. Right, so just to recap, green is an activity making a substantial contribution to an environmental objective and causing no harm to other EOs, right? For the Plus standard, to be green, you must be aligned to a 1.5 degree target in general. I say in general because there are exceptions. Amber is a transition tier or transition category. It contributes to the environmental objective, but there's some residual harm. So in the Plus standard, it is a transition activity and you cannot stay there forever. You can be there for a while, but over a period of time, you must become green. And red, of course, is just a no-no, right? Now, when I say no-no, I think I also need to explain this to you. Because many people have come to us, and not just us, but also our member states, and said, if it's red, we can't invest in it. Well, the answer is that if it's red, it's not taxonomy aligned, which means that it doesn't qualify under taxonomy. But it doesn't mean it won't get funding, because there will be people who still may want to fund it for different prices and different rates and different purposes, but it still can get funding. So a red should not be taken to be a project that cannot get funding. It should be taken as a project or an activity that is not aligned to the taxonomy and the taxonomy's objectives. But it could be aligned to another objective that's not within the scope of the taxonomy, so you can still get funding. How does the principles-based framework work? Well, you can see it's very simple. Firstly, there is a decision tree. So for if you take each of the environmental objectives has a different decision tree, and if you look at the decision tree, it's a very simple process, right? It says, let's look at the activity, let's look at what the activity is doing in terms of contributing. Does it cause any harm? Does it meet the essential criteria? If you follow the flow chart, you should be able to classify the activity as to green, red, and amber. Simple, not so simple, because when principles are used, you can have many different outcomes, depending on how you look at things. So understanding this and receiving feedback from stakeholders, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board provided guiding questions to produce more consistent answers. Not just that, they also came up with use cases. So there'll be more use cases, which are examples that come up over time. Is this a perfect structure? There's no perfect structure. There's no perfect approach. It is a very useful and effective approach for people who don't have the data, who are not ready with the data. Right? Again, all frameworks are subject to abuse, I have to say that. But over time, as the markets come together and we impose regulatory discipline, market discipline, and self-discipline, we'll find that it becomes more effective. An example is actually the Malaysian Central Bank. So Malaysian Central Bank uses this and has had the first year of reporting. And with that, it has formed a user group to discuss how to better implement and use this particular framework. Right. So I talked about Plus Standard. The Plus Standard actually covers 6 economic sectors that contribute to 85% of our GHG emissions and 55% of our gross value added. You might ask me, what about the other 15%? It's tough enough trying to address the 85%. That's the majority. So if we can cover 85% of emissions, it's a great job. And we should focus on this 85%. Right? The Plus Standard also has implementation guidance in the ASEAN taxonomy. So if you look at the ASEAN taxonomy, I mean, it's a really blur graphic, but you can follow a flowchart to help you, to guide you through the process, how to use the Plus Standard to arrive at the different tiers. Now, I just want to highlight certain things to you, right? When you set a standard like that, there are things that you have to consider. The first is, how do you set the technical screening criteria? Do you just pick a number? Do you just go to one person? For us, it's no. We actually have to be very careful how you set the technical screening criteria. And there must be principles to it. So because the ASEAN taxonomy uses tiers and has, as I mentioned to you, up to 3 thresholds for each economic activity, as opposed to the 1 threshold, i.e. the 100 grams per kilo hour that the EU taxonomy has, it is important to have principles to set each of these thresholds. So let me give you an example. We have decided that in general, for all sectors, the green tier should actually represent, as closely as possible, a 1.5 degree target, which means that we go close to the EU taxonomy. When we set the targets for power, we use the IA SDS line, which is approximately slightly more than 1.5 degrees, but we augmented it to come closer to 1.5 degrees. And essentially, we use that as a scientific basis. The period is also important, and it depends on the basis of your target setting. So because I said we use the SDS line, we look at the SDS line timing, and we set our technical screening criteria period over that line. And again, because we must always move forward, right? So those transition tiers are transition. They're not meant to be there forever. They have to be disapplied over time. So this application is called sunsetting. And we have a period by which the less ambitious tiers are sunset. So tier 3 would obviously be sunset first because it's less ambitious, and tier 2 would follow the sunsetting after that. While the tiers are in force, they may also be revised to be more strict, depending on the technological developments that are happening. So I talked about the tiers, and I think right now, maybe everyone's not so clear about it, but I can explain it in this way. So the tiers are actually, if you think of it, Lego blocks, right? They're all stacked. So the first block we have is actually a performance level which actually meets a 1.5 degree target. That's green. That's the most advanced. But you may have people who can't reach that level, but they're contributing significantly still, right? But not to the level of 1.5. Are you going to say no to them? I think it's a stepping stone. You have to allow it. So this is called tier 2. Then you have people who are on the way to tier 2 but not quite there yet, but it's still really above business as usual, and you want them to have a base to start. That's called tier 3. So over time, as you can see, tier 2 and tier 3 will be sunset, and tier 3 will be sunset first, then tier 2, and then eventually tier 1, the thresholds will become tighter and tighter, because by then we'll get closer to 2050, and by then there'll be change in the technology that we see. So very quickly, because I only have 10 minutes left, I talk about interoperability, right? So it's very important that whatever frameworks we come up with, they also work with other frameworks. Otherwise, what we have is fragmentation, in which everyone is utterly confused. And the purpose of having a taxonomy is to reduce fragmentation, not increase it. Today, take a guess, how many, when we first started the ASEAN taxonomy, we had probably 10 official taxonomies being worked on. Less than 10. Let's take a guess today, how many official and proprietary taxonomies there are. Proprietary means those owned by financial institutions. And let's only take these significant proprietary taxonomies, okay? So let's start, okay? 20. Everyone has put their hand because I recognize everybody's faces. Okay, 30. Okay, 40. Okay, jump. 70. No takers? 70, I saw a hand, 70, okay. Was that a hand? 70? 100? No. More or less? Okay. More. More, okay. 120. Ah, one hand. Good. 150. Don't know. Waiting for answer. So, okay, everyone knows, right? So should I start picking on people? Okay. 175. Okay. There are over 200 taxonomies today. 40, almost 50 official ones that come from governments, and another 150 substantial industry ones. So very good guess, very close. This is a problem. We need the taxonomies to be interoperable. So the first thing you need them to be interoperable on is the objectives. And if you look at it, actually, the ASEAN taxonomy, Thai taxonomy, and EU taxonomy are actually all interoperable at that level. EU taxonomy and Thai taxonomy is 6 objectives. The ASEAN taxonomy is 4, but that's because the last 2 actually are folded into the first 4. I just want to so I've gone through this with you about do no significant harm. Actually, I put more slides in because I was told that the slides would be available for download, so I thought that you can have a look at this on your own. But one thing I wanted to point to was the remedial measures to transition. As you can see, many people in ASEAN have adopted this approach, which is again unique to ASEAN, right? So Indonesia has adopted it, Malaysia has 2 taxonomies again, Philippines, and Thailand phase 1 has also adopted it. All right. Okay, so I just wanted to also share with you the approach we have to developing the technical screening criteria as I mentioned just now. So if you look at it, how do the tiers practically work? And many of you may be asking that question. So if you look at electricity, which is ISIC 351, and again it's important that I say that the economic class, the activity classification system you use also needs to be compatible so that you can compare activity to activity. Now, in ASEAN, all of us have a system that is based on ISIC, so it's very easy for us. And actually, even the European system is based on ISIC, needs a bit of reconciliation, a bit tougher, but can still be done. So if you look at how this is operationalized for electricity, the green tier, tier 1, is less than 100 grams per kilowatt hour. Now this is consistent with the EU, consistent with 1.5. Amber tier 2 is between 100 and 425. Now some of our countries can use this, some cannot. And again, amber tier 3 is between 425 and 510. Again, it's still tough for some countries, but we believe that this is the reasonable standard to set, because it's inclusive and it's credible, it's based on the SDS line as I shared with you just now, and also it allows everyone to participate and to slowly improve themselves to get to tier 1 within the stipulated time, right? So it's also important to remember that this refers to life cycle analysis, life cycle emissions. So you have to be more cautious about this, and at the same time, we have to also understand that if you put something that's too ambitious, it's not going to work. So for us in the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, when we set this, we had to really balance between ambition and reality, and we wanted an outcome that was achievable. So there was a lot of discussion around this. Okay, and of course, construction and real estate generally for construction, we set against the international green certification and also the standards we have in our member states. And for transportation and storage, we set against the best technological standards like the Euro standard for land-based activities. For water-based, we use IMO 2023 GHG strategy. And for airlines, we are looking at it, but certainly we know there are a lot of changes coming out. Okay, very quickly, who uses taxonomies? Actually, the growing need for the growing use of taxonomies has been recognized, so everybody's starting to find new users for it. And I can summarize it for you. Basically, it's to orient capital, number one. Number two, it's actually to help those people who are using capital understand what is sustainable. And then number three, it's for risk management. And four, importantly, many people forget this, help develop and implement government policy, because a lot of governments want to understand how to implement their policy, and the taxonomy helps them. They also use the taxonomy in developing their own policy. So I've given you a list. I've extracted this from the different taxonomies. You can look at your own time. Now, important. How do we, as a region, work with the ASEAN taxonomy? I can summarize it for you here. In Malaysia, the taxonomy is actually, for the central bank taxonomy, is actually aligned to the foundation framework. For the Securities Commission's SRI taxonomy, it's the foundation framework. Thailand taxonomy phase 1 uses the traffic lights system from the plus standard. Singapore Asia taxonomy, same thing. Indonesia taxonomy for sustainable finance, very interesting, uses both the plus standard and the foundation framework in a very, very innovative manner. They are proportionate. Small companies use the foundation framework because it's easy on them. Big companies use the plus standard. And I think that is a very innovative way of approaching an economy like Indonesia's. Philippines uses the foundation framework. Now, if you compare all the different elements we have between the ASEAN taxonomy, EU taxonomy, Singapore Asia taxonomy, Thailand taxonomy phase 1, Indonesia taxonomy for sustainable finance, and the Malaysian taxonomy, and the two Malaysian taxonomies and the Philippine taxonomy. Basically, you see all the environmental objectives are aligned. In terms of focus sectors, they generally cover, if you are technical screen criteria-based taxonomy, you cover the same things. Traffic light systems or multi-tiered systems are actually used for ASEAN, not in the EU. The technical screen criteria, there's some mapping along the way, right? So you can map them. So every taxonomy can be mapped against a tier of the ASEAN taxonomy. We all include social aspects, and we all include do no significant harm. So actually taxonomies now, the way it's being developed, certainly in ASEAN, we are closer to each other than ever. So the ASEAN taxonomy is regarded as one of the 3 most influential taxonomies in the Netisics report. And also, the Abu Dhabi Global Markets has named the ASEAN taxonomy as one of the 3 taxonomies it accepts under its rulebook, together with the EU taxonomy and the taxonomy used by the multilateral development banks. ASEAN taxonomy is referenced in all the other taxonomy development processes. Very quickly, I just want to touch on this, my last 3 minutes. I talked about transition, so I felt it's important to alert you to this because we talk about transition bonds. So right now, we have many, many different transition guidances coming out. And yet ASEAN decided to come up with its own transition finance guidance in October last year. Why? Well, all these guidances are great, but they don't contextualize for ASEAN. So many of our 71 million MSMEs will find it very hard to fully adopt any of these. So the ASEAN capital market regulators took the first step, and what they did was they looked at the 6 most widely used taxonomy transition finance references in the world. It took all the critical elements from these 6 guidances, and as you can see, actually it's full mapping against all the 6 guidances. CBI is a little bit, there's a white space there because the CBI approach doesn't take into account just transitions, whereas actually just transitions are extremely important for ASEAN. So you see that generally, all the critical elements from these 6 frames have been taken and put into the ASEAN transition finance guidance. The big ASEAN transition finance guidance has 2 big elements contributing to the ASEAN contextualization. The first is most of the transition finance guidances today only reference a 1.5 degree target. We know this is really hard, and we have to go back to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities under the Paris Agreement. We want to encourage everybody to be able to meet something Paris Agreement aligned. Paris Agreement aligned means well below 2, preferably 1.5 degree. So we have included a well below 2 degree class to be considered. And what happens if people are really trying to get to well below 2 but can't? They shouldn't be ignored. We shouldn't say, oh, you can't get financing because you're not there. We should say, well, let's support you and give you 2 years to get to the well below 2 degree category. So if you can come up with a plan that's credible to align or to be aligning to a well below 2 degree, we shouldn't ignore you. The second element is the use of transition pathways. Now, there are a lot of guidances out there who ask for science-based pathways, and they reference certain, that is an implicit reference to certain approaches that need to be taken. Now, some of those are really hard for our MSMEs to do, and MSMEs, as you know, form the value chain. So talk to any large corporate like Thai Union, for example. You actually need to be able to address your supply chain for you to meet your own goals. So we want to encourage the use or facilitate, I would say, the use of more pathways that are credible, that can more easily be adopted. So we think that it's good to have more science-based pathways. Apart from IEA, you can have NGFS, you can have AREA, you can have IPCC. Also, we want to look at industry pathways as well, like those published by IATA and IMO. I talked about them just now. We reference them for the taxonomy as well. And many of you know, right, this is about absolute emissions. So many of the transition finance approaches, they talk about, reduction of absolute emissions. That's great for developed countries, but for developing countries, our economies grow, our populations grow, urbanization rates grow, and we're still developing. We have to increase the standard of living. Remember, 5,400 average versus 37,500 average in Europe. We might have to consider, or we have to consider, other approaches. Maybe not absolute emissions, but emissions intensity. Would that work? I think the idea is we must find a way to make it work. You can still use emissions intensities if you can actually get a pathway to decarbonize in parallel with the global line and converge as soon as possible. And that is what the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance tries to do. It tries to open up alternative, practical ways for our companies to be able to transition and decarbonize. So I encourage you to have a look at it, but I will say that the way it works with the taxonomy is that the Transition Finance Guidance references taxonomies, technological pathways, and technology lists. So if you can transition your operations and your technology through the tiers of the ASEAN taxonomy at the speed of a science-based pathway, then you should qualify for transition finance, right? So to close, what are the challenges? Well, firstly, I think sustainability is here to stay, and it will be factored into finance, investment, and trade all the time. In 2017, I was asked at a panel, and they said, when we launched the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, they said, well, how long do you think sustainable finance will last? Is it a fad? And I said, well, it'll probably be gone in 25 years. And everyone was shocked, and they said, you mean it's a fad? I said, no, I mean, in 25 years, if you don't factor in sustainability, you won't get finance. So you don't even have to say sustainable finance. It's going to be like creditworthiness. It's just going to be factored in. The second is that you can see from the charts I showed, there's significant demand for sustainable finance and to finance sustainability. We need a lot of money for that. So there's a need for more financial products and services. We see a lot of innovative things coming out, everything from SLBs to transition bonds, which Japan has done, to, let's say, green banking accounts. And the good thing is the sustainable finance ecosystem is strengthening with the taxonomy, with transitions, and of course with disclosures moving on. Downside, well, things are still relatively new. There's no real common understanding and agreement yet at the level that we wanted, but that is growing. The project pipeline and deal supply is still lacking, so I know it's a bit hard to push this for those deal originators. Capacity is an issue. I'm glad we have sessions like this because it certainly builds on the capacity. The risk-reward mismatch, I mean, some of these projects, particularly like adaptation, as I mentioned just now, it's difficult because the risk-reward profile may not be there. So we're hoping for the MDBs to come in and to help de-risk us. And of course, you know, sustainable finance has extra requirements. So it will take a bit more money, it'll take a bit more effort. But at the end of the day, we don't have a choice. It is going to happen, it is happening. Well, so with that, thank you very much for listening to me and not falling asleep. I shall hand over back to the MC. Thank you.
Yes. Is there any questions คะ
Questions.
ถ้ามีท่านใดมีคำถามเรียนเชิญได้เลยนะคะ เดี๋ยวขออนุญาตให้ทีมงานนะคะลีดไมโครโฟนไปให้นิดนึงค่ะ มีคำถามสามารถยกมือได้เลยนะคะ หรือจะค่ะขออนุญาตเป็นทางโต๊ะด้านหลังนะคะ คุณแจ่มจันทร์ค่ะ เรียนเชิญค่ะ
Just as I was walking off the stage.
So just keep you there. Since Thai SEC is also working on the transition finance guidance, they are waiting for the ASEAN transition finance coming up, rolling out as well. I have a question as well because there are a lot of companies that study on this since they are in the bio industry. Whether or not they in their journey to be part of the transition financing, would it require them to apply for science-based target membership?
Okay, SBTI particularly, which is SBTI is having a lot of fun at the moment. So firstly, I would thank SEC Thailand for their contributions because they did contribute quite a bit to the transition finance guidance version 1, and version 2 is coming out, so we're in the process of starting version 2. Yeah, so that's a really good question because one of the things now is that as I said just now, many people are looking for science-based targets and then they're saying, oh, use SBTI, use SBTI. I don't think all our 71 million MSMEs can use SBTI. I don't think even all our large companies can use SBTI. So the ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance is trying to facilitate the use of alternative pathways that are credible, so we have to be able to define. And I think some of it really, if you can align back to, let's say, an industry target like Mission Possible or IMO, we should be open to that. We have been in discussions with other regulators out of ASEAN as well as to how we can come together to create a broader pathway. Because I think as we talk, right, we talk, and it's so difficult, people just don't do. So we need to be able to get action moving as fast as we can. Yeah.
มีอีก
So there will be alternative options.
Yeah, actually, we've been discussing some of these alternatives. So in version 2, and we'll definitely come and look for you for comments and to give feedback. Yes, we are looking at alternatives because I recognize one of the things we hear a lot about is that the existing approaches may be expensive, long, and we may not have the resources for it.
Hi, Eugene. Thank you so much for all this knowledge. I just want to wonder if for our issuers who are here, maybe they may be a bit overwhelmed of all these informations. What will be the first 1-2 steps that you would guide us that where shall they start with?
The first case should always be your business strategy. Because, you know, as I mentioned before, this really has to tie back to the real economy. And so the question you need to ask is, how does my business strategy need to transform to meet sustainability requirements? And they're coming in many forms. I talked about the business requirement just now. And it's very funny. It's a good question you asked too, because I was at a gathering of lawyers the other day, and they were talking about investment due diligence. So in the past, for example, just moving away from climate for a while, right? Talking about social aspects. So in the past, when you get an investor, for construction, they ask, do your foreign workers get a mattress? The question today is, how thick are the mattresses your foreign workers get? Right? And there used to be another question, how many, do you provide toilets for your foreign workers at the dorm? The question now is, how many workers share one toilet? That's how it's moving, right? And even if you look at the suppliers, like Standard Chartered did a survey, and if you look at Standard Chartered survey, it's a shocking number of MNCs who say that by 2025, if you as a supplier cannot meet their own, the MNC's own targets, they will drop you, because by law, for example, in the EU, they have to meet certain targets. So the first is, I think you need to look at your business strategy and understand where you need to transform. Then you decide how much money you would like for that to happen. And then you must have a framework of how you are going to make that happen. So I think these are important steps for businesses in existence. If you are a person who wants to start a new project or a new activity, then again, I think that analysis should be some form of understanding how what you're trying to do may comply with the different requirements as reflected in taxonomies, for instance, and see whether or not you should how you are going to translate that into whether the project is viable, not from a financial perspective, but from an environmental objective perspective. And then, of course, from there you start working to make sure again that you have a financing framework, a green framework that actually suits what you want to do, and base your financing from that. So I also think that today Thai Union will be will give an excellent presentation on that, and certainly I think from the banker's perspective as well, that would be very helpful. Also DNV, because there's the external review that's required.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Eugene.
One more question.
Thanks. Hello. Thanks for sharing. I'm wondering, are there any discussion among the regulators within the committee on what should be the incentive for company embarking on these either green, blue, or sustainability-linked activity?
So excellent question, right? Because the Working Committee on Capital Market Development report actually talks about should incentives be given and how can they be given. So for issuances, for instance, today we have quite a number of incentives on, in Thailand you have extended incentives as well, but the incentives really center around the cost of getting a framework together, like for example, Singapore, or getting external assurance, which are actually very small compared to total costs. I think the real incentive really should be how we make it easier for issuers to come to market. So to make it easier for issuers to come to market, there are a few things. The first is we should enable them to have very clear frameworks that they can use at lower cost. So rather than go through a lot of effort trying to understand what they have to do, if we had some form of very clear guidance that helps them qualify. The second is obviously more importantly, for the regulators to come together to promote those frameworks on an international scale so that international investors accept them. I think that frankly lowers the cost, although you don't see it's not a physical incentive, but it actually lowers the cost and increases the viability of the issuance. If you look at, say, issuances today, actually we don't see much greenium. In fact, sometimes the overall costs are higher. But at the same time, in the future, the availability of capital and cost of capital will be affected if you are not sustainable. I'll tell you why. So firstly, if you look at the banks all are pushed as well. They are shareholders who have their own sustainability targets. So the banks have to meet these targets. Whether they're raising money from equity from shareholders, they're raising debt from the capital markets, they need this. They need to also align. So it would be more expensive for them and harder for them to access capital if they are not sustainably aligned. And therefore, that will trickle down to their customers as well. So I think it's important that everyone starts to prepare for this. I know incentives are very important to start off, and we have some incentives, but I think the real incentive should be the long-term access and cost to capital, which is actually more pertinent and is going to be, that's where the effect is going to be felt. Because we already see some banks asking for information already. And don't forget, banks also look at your sustainability approaches in evaluating your credit. So it is very important to start looking at those aspects today. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
May I just make a short wrap up in Thai for participants, please? คุณยูจีนนะคะก็ได้กล่าวถึงหลักเกณฑ์นะคะและมาตรฐานที่สำคัญของการออก ESG bond นะคะได้แก่ ICMA Sustainable Bond Principle นะคะ ASEAN Taxonomy และ ASEAN Transition Finance Guidance นะคะซึ่งทางผู้ออกหรือว่าผู้ที่สนใจเนี่ยควรที่จะทำความเข้าใจนะคะเพื่อที่จะนำไปสู่โอกาสและความสำเร็จในการระดมทุนค่ะ Thank you very much Mr. Eugene Wong นะคะ for sharing insightful information of sustainable bond financing ค่ะขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับคุณยูจินอีกครั้งหนึ่งค่ะ Next we are going to have a short coffee break in front of the meeting room เดี๋ยวขอเชิญทุกท่านนะคะพักรับประทานอาหารว่างหน้าห้องสัมมนานะคะแล้วกลับมาพบกันอีกครั้งหนึ่งตอน 11:15 ค่ะเรียนเชิญค่ะสามารถที่จะนำของเบรกเข้ามาทานในห้องได้นะคะขอบคุณค่ะ